Welcome to this video blog. My name is Doris Vries and I want to tell you something about a well-known Dutch writer and columnist, named Hugo Brandt Corstius. Dutch author Hugo Brandt Corstius died on February 28, 2014. On the internet you still find many positive references to this man, born on August 29, 1935 in Eindhoven, Netherlands, known for his achievements in both literature and science. In 1970, he was awarded a PhD on the subject of computational linguistics. He was employed at the Mathematics Center in Amsterdam. However, to the general public he is mostly known for his writing, in particular as a columnist for opinion magazine Vrij Nederland and national newspaper De Volkskrant, and as linguist and literary critic for Vrij Nederland, De Volkskrant, and national newspaper NRC Handelsblad. Hugo Brandt Corstius was a very intelligent and active person, who could lead his pen brilliantly. Vrij Nederland, De Volkskrant, and NRC Handelsblad, for which he wrote many columns, have honored him through an in memoriam or special article. Even right-wing news magazine Elsevier refused to add any criticism to the news of his dying. And there still lingers a video on YouTube calling for a simple tribute to Hugo Brandt Corstius. Nevertheless, he should not be remembered as a great stylist or writer, and neither as a great scientist. I can understand why people close to him have the urge to celebrate him, why they want to look back at him as someone who did good for society and humanity in general. And I can understand why Elsevier did not criticize him just after he had deceased. But time passes. And looking more objective from a distance at his publicly known achievements, Hugo Brandt Corstius, in all honesty, doesn't deserve any of these homages. He was a very mean, indecent and narcissistic person who actually enjoyed, in the sense of having fun, to slander others in such a brutal manner that they would become societally isolated and break down. And that was indeed his sadistic intention, the sole purpose of his personal attacks and character assassinations. Verbal violence as replacement for physical aggression merely to destroy others who dared to express another, yet still respectable political or scientific opinion. Just a few examples of an opus of insulting and smearing stories expanning many decades. When Dutch Minister of Finance, Onno Ruding, in the 1980s tried to limit the influx of new social welfare recipients, Hugo Brandt Corstius wrote in Vrij Nederland, "All techniques applied during the Holocaust are now on display in the hunt for people with the lowest welfare allowances. The Jews a star? Welfare recipients a pass." The plan of Ruding to shorten welfare allowances of people who did not wanted to look for or accept a paid job, a very normal policy, and this even today in the Netherlands, was labeled by Brandt Corstius as the final solution, thus as the final and definite killing of all European Jews by Hitler. Furthermore, he stated, "The unthankful have to starve. Starving takes too long. Gassing them is better. Ruding is the Eichmann of our time." Another of Brandt Corstius' victims was Dutch criminologist Wouter Bockhausen. Bockhausen wanted to investigate the causes of criminal behavior. Other than what was customary in those days, Bockhausen did not focus on environmental factors, nurture, but biological factors, nature. In 1979, Bockhausen expounded his thoughts, plans and research proposals for such a socio-biological study. Bockhausen believed that people can have an inborn criminal disposition. That idea was not in agreement with the dominant tabula rasa doctrine of that time. Therefore, Hugo Brandt Corstius attacked Bockhausen week after week in national media solely for his intended research, calling him a right extremist and a Nazi, over and over again, with the aim to incite dupable leftist followers to make Bockhausen's personal life so miserable and dangerous that he would retreat. The result was indeed that Bockhausen received death threats, was insulted, berated for Nazi criminologist, and accused of wanting to perform brain surgery on detainees. At lectures he got things thrown at his head. People stormed the stage and threatened him physically. In the end also the University of Leiden, where Bockhausen worked, betrayed him, and Bockhausen had to withdraw himself from academic life. It was a deliberate plan of Hugo Brandt Corstius to eliminate Bockhausen in this manner, who apparently had ideas not in line with those of Brandt Corstius. That in itself was sufficient justification to destroy Bockhausen systematically. Hugo Brandt Corstius showed no remorse afterwards and could not admit he had been wrong all along about the issues in dispute. Even in 1995 he was proud that he had successfully removed Wouter Bockhausen from the scene, and was merely sad that other gentlemen of genes were already trying to start the same rubbish. In 2009, Hugo Brandt Corstius exposed in a television interview that he hadn't learned a thing from his many previous mistakes, made over a period of more than 40 years, and that he was unable to look at himself as that what he really was, an extremely intelligent linguistic artist, yet with an emotional disorder, due to which he only seemed to be able to satisfy himself by hurting others gruesomely.
Het Leidse Universiteitsblad vroeg mij om een stuk te schrijven wat ik nu van Buikhuizen vond. Ja. Nou vind ik dat een stom blaadje, maar ik dacht, nou ik wil dat stuk wel schrijven. Dus heb ik het aan de NRC gestuurd. En in dat stuk maak ik Buikhuizen totaal belachelijk. Maar dat blijkt dat heel veel mensen het geïnterpreteerd hebben als een soort terugtrekking. Omdat ik zeg, ja, Buikhuizen heeft groot gelijk. Natuurlijk, we moeten de hersenen onderzoeken. Maar dat wou Buikhuizen in de tijd helemaal niet. Nee. Tenminste, hij zei dat hij niet wou. En hij is ook geen hersenkundige natuurlijk, hij weet niks. Maar dus het ging hem helemaal om hoe hard je zweten en zo. En nu zijn er een aantal criminologen, of hoe je die mensen ook moet noemen, die zeggen, ja, we moeten in de hersenen kijken. Nou ja, dat is natuurlijk waar op zich. Iemand die een misdaad gaat plegen, die heeft iets in zijn hersenen, namelijk een plan om een misdaad te plegen. Ja.
Vind je wat Buikhuizen beweert nu nog meer belachelijk dan in de tijd eigenlijk?
Nee, precies zo, precies zo.
Want wat is de essentie dan van wat je vindt?
Nou kijk, dat geleerden nieuwsgierig zijn en rare dingen onderzoeken, vind ik helemaal niet erg. Nee. Maar de pretentie die hij had, dat hij elk jaar weer al wist of een bepaald iemand misdadig is door te kijken naar zijn zweet en naar andere dingen, vond ik zo belachelijk. Ik begrijp niet dat mensen hem serieus nemen.
Wat is daar belachelijk aan?
Nou, als het zo simpel was, dan zouden we het al lang weten. Ik bedoel, zo werkt het niet. We zijn allemaal misdadig in zekere zin.
It's clear. In this interview, Hugo Brandt Corstius tries to excuse himself by telling yet again numerous lies. Wouter Bockhausen had not, as Brandt Corstius now implies, the pretension to know it all, and certainly not merely by observing someone's sweat secretion. Neurological and biochemical science at that time weren't so advanced as today. Bockhausen wasn't a brain or neurological specialist and did not claim that either. He simply wanted to look from another angle than social environment, how criminal behavior emerged, and if signs thereof could be detected objectively. Using a new idea to move forward in scientific and human advancement. That's how it should be in science, under the perception that the study may appear to be useless or result in other conclusions than expected. But that was not allowed. That was the only crime Bockhausen had committed, that is to say, trying a new approach, one that wasn't permitted according to leftist believers in the blank slate theory who thought they knew it all and dominated public opinion making so rigorously. So even science had to be stopped and subdued to their ideological belief. Just as all religious and political ideologies before had tried to stop science from finding unwanted proven conclusions undermining the absolute truth of the leading ideology. It's always the same. Also in this case. And Brandt Corstius was the one among those leftist intellectuals spreading their one-sided ideological propaganda so aggressively through media channels over Dutch society, who was prepared to go the furthermost in putting disbelievers to the sword, not hindered by emotional scruples, ostensibly absent in him by nature. Now, in this TV interview, he is deliberately turning things around. Apparently, when you look at the rest of the interview, Hugo Brandt Corstius has finally come to the conclusion that the functioning of the human brain largely depends on a process created by Darwinian evolution. This notion is, of course, radically in conflict with his earlier beliefs, and in fact in agreement with the idea behind Wouter Bockhausen's intended research, thus with the angle from which Bockhausen wanted to start his research. But instead of admitting that he was so terribly wrong in the 1970s and 80s, and that he had victimized Bockhausen so violently on false assumptions, Brandt Corstius tries to talk his way out by shifting the emphasis to the allegedly wrong methods of Bockhausen. Now he claims that he doesn't mind what scientists study or if a personal curiosity or idea lays at the basis of their research, but that the used means and starting points of Bockhausen were wrong, when, actually, at that time, he only moaned about the idea behind Bockhausen's study for it wasn't in agreement with Brandt Corstius and his mate's subjective ideological view, and he only opposed to the applied means and starting points because they revealed that Bockhausen did not believe absolute and unquestionably in their self-invented story of the truth. Conceit due to a lack of knowledge and understanding was the ground for attacking others. The sin of these others? Not believing in the dominant ideology, questioning the almighty truth of the intellectual elite. That was the only sin of Bockhausen that caused Hugo Brandt Corstius to eliminate this sincere scientist, with use of all means at Brandt Corstius' disposal. Like in the days of the Roman Catholic Inquisition, or Stalin's hunting days, or Hitler's, or you name it. They are all the same, those so madly in love with themselves and their own vision of the world. A great man would at least have admitted that he was wrong, both in his petty ideas and how he has mistreated others on account thereof so stupidly. That would at least provide a beginning for self-reflection and to move forward. A coward liar tries to hide his error and terrible behavior by telling yet again another lie and by picking on the victim once more so as to disguise his own smallness and insignificance. For someone madly in love with himself, it's apparently impossible to criticize the subject of his devout admiration. And, obviously, the left-wing journalist interviewing Hugo Brandt Corstius lets him get away with this white lie now proclaimed so unashamed on national TV, for they all believed and acted like the liar back then, and are glad that their fallacy seems to have been repaired by this cold calculating fabricator. Brandt Corstius is granted complete freedom to cunningly create the impression that they, those noble intellectuals, in spite of all facts and evidence, are not to blame for this terrible malice of that time. After all, so they now have established jointly, it was Bockhausen who used the wrong methods. Yes, the wrong methods and starting points, of which one could see in advance that they couldn't result in a solid answer. At least, that's what the greatest detractor of that appalling group of intellectuals says today. Then it must be true. And yes, they all conclude agreeable, that indeed was the reason that Bockhausen was criticized. That's it. That's our way out. Bockhausen was wrong all along. For his methods. Not we. We did not try to block scientific progress by prohibiting certain premises in advance. No way. We all saw immediately that the methods and starting points of Bockhausen were shaky. That's what we wanted to make clear. Not that he wasn't allowed to study some specific subjects or use certain approaches. Of course not. That's the basis of science. We never intended that. Honestly. It was only because of the false methods and starting points that could not lead to a proper scientific conclusion. That's why we destroyed this man in mutual cooperation. That's why we slandered him publicly and stirred up believers to attack him. So, now it seems, that we noble intellectuals, are still the good ones, the ones who know it all. We weren't mistaken. We didn't act appalling. Just as we weren't wrong by supporting Mao, Pol Pot, and Enver Hoxha. We are still the righteous ones. The moral leaders of a Western nation in disarray. So, you see the interviewer think, let him lie, this cruel man. Please, Hugo, lie a bit more for us. Come on. Do it for the sake of the greater good, our greater good. Change reality so that we can still love ourselves as the ultimate product of excellence that humanity has brought forward. And subsequently, all who had acted so indecent and filthy in the past want to believe this new explanation so desperately, just so that they can keep believing in their self-proclaimed intellectual and moral superiority, that they probably are able to fool themselves once again. They haven't learned a thing. But then what about multiculturalism? Another glorious idea of these leftish witch hunters, based on nothing else than an unproven subjective interpretation of what's good and wrong and founded on a not evidenced model of the correct human being, of course ultimately with yet again terrible results for society, because the conviction in their own intellectual and moral superiority has let these intellectuals think that it was unnecessary to check the natural rules of the universe in advance. If these rules would point at a different outcome, they were wrong and had to be adjusted. Society and mankind had to be adjusted and modeled in line with the fabulous ideas of these superb intellectuals. Who the hell do these criticizers of our absolute truth think they are? These moral scabs. So let's get them. And thus, in 2000, Hugo Brandt Corstius attacked, as he had always done, all who dared to insinuate that multiculturalism had failed and had led to backlogs among non-Western immigrants. As usual, no objective response was given by Brandt Corstius to these apostates. No facts or logical argumentation were used to contradict their not allowed view. Immediately all available instruments were raised from the still intact trenches to disparage the dissident in person, calling him a racist and fascist. Character assassination. Destroying the medium instead of the message, since the latter could not be refuted by sound arguments, yet knowing that when the medium is gone, the message will not be heard either anymore. That's the way how Hugo Brandt Corstius and his fellow opinion makers reacted to people with another opinion. Yes, you hear well. Just for having another opinion, that afterwards, incidentally, appeared to be correct altogether. And these so-called refined intellectuals didn't hesitate to destroy a man and his family if this was done for their greater good, a self-invented fairy tale, that all of them, however, for some strange reason, seemed to regard as the absolute and eternal truth. But has it ever been different? It's the predictable attitude of an elite with too much power due to the absence of a solid controlling mechanism within their media environment. That's the sad truth about public opinion making in the Netherlands, a process that started in the 1960s and is still visible today. An entire nation has let itself stirred up by these lunatics, of whom Hugo Brandt Corstius was merely one of the leading figures. In retrospect, it was insane. But we seem to have silently become so accustomed to this madness that we are still unable to detect similar ideological propaganda from Dutch media today. We have started to look at their ideological view as the normal standard. And as a result, other visions, how logical and true they may be, are evaluated as extreme and abnormal in that context. That truly hinders us in developing our own thoughts and finding sound solutions for actual problems. Multiculturalism and European integration are not valued as extreme mass-scale social experiments lacking any sound substantiation, what they actually are. Instead, pointing at problems and predictable shortcomings involved with these experiments, although that criticism is backed by earlier experiences, facts, and research, makes you an extremist. The context to evaluate processes has shifted from facts and logical arguments to a subjective ideological view which derives its dominant status only from endless repetition in politics, media, and education, yet not from objective and logical determinations. A large part of what we hear through mass media channels today is just ideological propaganda with the aim to condition the minds of an entire nation. Sure, the method Hugo Brandt Corstius and the like used for their politically motivated assaults was a bit different than the Nazis and Stalinists used during their period in history. But not so very different either. Similar actions were conducted by Stalinist and Nazi propagandists against people with other political ideas. And the intent was exactly the same. Simply destroy all dissidents with deviant opinions by brutal force and violence so as to uphold the leading ideology. Why should such a horrible man as Hugo Brandt Corstius with such vile attitudes be honored in public, thus outside his close circle of family and friends? Because he was a linguistic phenomenon? Because so many similar people made the same mistake and enfolded the same terrible attitude? That's not correct. The fact that million Christians or Muslims believe in some wrong ideology is no excuse in itself, and certainly not for those who claim, as highly educated intellects, to use their rational capacities to approach a question or problem. And it's not correct in view of the many victims Brandt Corstius has damaged during his life with his vicious acts. It's incorrect as well in view of human advancement. Hugo Brandt Corstius' approach and attitude were a setback for moral progress, of which we experience the negative consequences up until today. The real legacy of this man is not so beautiful as his admirers want the public to believe. For me, he is the starting point in the Netherlands of a transition in the task of journalism. From providers of objective information to the public, journalists and media opinion makers have turned themselves more and more into active manipulators of public opinion to satisfy their own ideological purposes. This is a straight attack on democracy, because democracy needs objective providers of information. Otherwise people aren't able to make a valid assessment in the election booth, in making a choice how they want to live. In truth, such manipulators as Hugo Brandt Corstius try to avoid that people can make a sound decision in agreement with their own views and interests. A democracy where voters have no opportunity to evaluate various topics on account of objective information, is no democracy. It's in conflict with the principle that every citizen, as a sovereign free individual, is allowed to participate equally in the democratic decision-making process. Apparently, some sovereign free individuals are not entitled to make up their own minds freely, for their ideas could be opposite to what is ideologically desired according to some others. Therefore, these so-called sovereign, free and equal individuals must follow the ideas of those who manipulate public opinion for their own reasons, because the latter think they are more equal than the ones to be fooled. Like children believing in Santa Claus, the public is deliberately deceived for this purpose. All for the greater good, of course, and with the best intentions. That's always the justification used by any religious or political believer. The greater good is the most important of the conceptions to be defended, and therefore legitimizes to lie and cheat, and worse. I do not think that Hugo Brandt Corstius personally is to blame for this transition of the function of journalism, a development devastating for a liberal democracy based on the principles of equality and freedom for all. It is visible in all Western societies. But he is a Dutch icon of this disastrous process and stands for everything that's wrong in this respect. That's how he should be remembered by the public. Apart from that, we still can learn from people like Hugo Brandt Corstius. Maybe that's his most important gift to humanity. He provides the proof that someone's intelligence and wittiness, his great capacity to articulate and formulate, his mathematic excellence, his erudition, his linguistic virtuosity, are not a guarantee for the correctness of his views. Hugo Brandt Corstius has been wrong in respect of almost all matters in regard to which he tried to impose his one-sided vision so violently on others. He shows us therefore that empathy and human compassion, which he lacked, are just as important for assessing the best solutions for societal problems as rational capacities and cognitive abilities. He proves that even a high intellect can be fooled by a man's own emotional beliefs, that rationality can be suppressed by subjective silly ideas instigated by a man's emotions or, in this case, lack of certain essential emotions. He makes clear that a wrong basic choice can't be healed with rational tricks and slandering, but that these instruments merely postpone the application of measures required to repair that wrong choice. He learned us that abundantly flirting with the superiority of your morality so as to justify your personal opinion, is an empty phrase, and, in addition, that not the one who shouts the loudest and most aggressively that he is morally right, has morality at his side. These are aspects we should have in mind when we think of Hugo Brandt Corstius. That's his real legacy. Let's be careful with the use of subjective morality to justify what is wrong on closer inspection. Let that subjective morality not hinder us from taking that closer look. And certainly do not abuse such a self-invented correct morality as legitimation to stop others from taking such a closer look instead.